9 movies walked into June 2026 carrying massive budgets and the weight of legacy IP behind them, and most walked out with studios staring at 9-figure losses. Masters of the Universe, budgeted at up to $200 million, finished second on its opening weekend to a horror comedy. A beloved galaxy far, far away quietly became the lowest-grossing live-action Star Wars film in the franchise's history. A DC hero sharing the same cinematic universe as Superman, built under James Gunn's newly restructured DC Studios, managed a B- cinema score. June 2026 didn't just produce a handful of disappointments. It produced a pattern, and that pattern is worth understanding. According to tracking reported by Deadline and Variety, the summer 2026 box office season may represent the most concentrated run of legacy IP failures in a single month in recent Hollywood history. Here's every flop from that month, ranked from the ones that nearly made it to the ones that never stood a chance. Greenland. 2 arrived with a clear advantage. The original Greenland worked. A lean, efficient disaster movie that found a genuine audience during the pandemic years, the first film proved the formula could connect when the timing was right. Gerard Butler and Morena Baccarin both returned, and the goodwill toward them as a screen pairing carried real weight coming in. What the sequel couldn't outrun was the market it landed in, because by 2026, audiences had already sat through a full cycle of civilization, ending storytelling, and 28 years later had consumed much of that genre's energy the previous summer. You'd think a proven franchise with returning stars and studio backing would be insulated from that kind of timing problem, but the marketing couldn't articulate what made this particular installment worth the trip back to the cinema. Rotten Tomatoes scores settled somewhere in the low 50s, with the exact figure varying depending on which count you pull. No single villain caused this one. Sometimes the market simply moves on before the sequel arrives to meet it. Andy Serkis directed an animated adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm, with Seth Rogen voicing Napoleon and Gaten Matarazzo voicing a character named Lucky, an original creation with no presence anywhere in Orwell's source material. Sit with that for a moment. Animal Farm, one of the most precisely constructed political allegories in the English language, and the adaptation introduces a new character named Lucky. The film reportedly leaned into a family-friendly tone that stripped the source material of its satirical edge, which is roughly equivalent to adapting 1984 as a cozy workplace comedy, and the box office results reflected what happens when a film loses its identity trying to please everyone at once. Families didn't want a political allegory, even a defanged one, and adult fans of the novel had no interest in a version without teeth. The audience that wanted exactly this specific combination of elements turned out to be quite small, and the numbers confirmed it without mercy. The market here wasn't cruel, it was just honest. Maggie Gyllenhaal's follow-up to The Lost Daughter retells Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from the bride's perspective, placing Jessie Buckley in the lead and Christian Bale opposite her as Frankenstein himself. And on paper, that creative proposition is genuinely interesting. 2 exceptional performers working with a director who earned real critical credibility on her debut, built on source material rich enough to support 100 different interpretations. The challenge was always going to be the marketing, because Frankenstein retold from the bride's perspective requires a very precise campaign to reach a mainstream audience, and the evidence suggests that precision never arrived. Specific box office figures weren't widely reported at the time of research, which is its own kind of signal, because when a studio doesn't lead with the numbers, those numbers are usually doing something embarrassing in the background. This one is actually kind of sad because the creative ambition is genuine and the performances deserve better than the silence that greeted them commercially. Ambition without reach doesn't fill seats. A24 built its reputation on films that resist easy categorization, and Mother Mary, directed by David Lowery and starring Anne Hathaway, sits firmly in that tradition, blending thriller, musical, and romantic drama into something trade press struggled to summarize in a single sentence. The production budget came in at around $20 million, modest enough that even a modest return should have covered it, which makes the worldwide gross of just under $3 million genuinely hard to explain away as a near miss. That figure isn't a disappointment. It's a near total commercial absence. Timing complicated things further because Mother Mary opened just before The Devil Wears Prada 2, placing Anne Hathaway in the cultural conversation twice in close succession, and two films anchored by the same star in quick sequence creates a kind of interference pattern that tends to benefit neither release. A24 has absorbed losses of this scale before and come out the other side with its reputation intact, and that is genuinely the most optimistic framing available for what happened here. Dead Man's Wire carries a 91% certified fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with Gus Van Sant directing and a cast that includes Bill Skarsgård, Al Pacino, Coleman Domingo, and Cary Elwes. And critics responded to it with the kind of enthusiasm that usually translates into at least a respectable art house run. Against a $15 million production budget, the worldwide gross landed at just over $2 million, and the reason sits almost entirely with the distributor. Roque Entertainment released Dead Man's Wire as its very first film, not its first wide release or its first prestige project, but its first release of any kind, and a distributor with no established exhibitor relationships, no marketing infrastructure, and no prior experience sent a Gus Van Sant film into the market essentially unequipped to reach the audience that would have shown up for it. Reports at the time suggested Roque's financial position could affect the rest of its 2026 slate, which means the consequences extended well beyond this single title. A 91% certified fresh score alongside a $2 million gross is one of the most disheartening combinations in this entire list because the film isn't the flop. The distribution strategy is the flop, and that distinction matters. Speaking of productions where the creative instincts were sound but the commercial outcome fell short, Steven Spielberg returning to alien territory with an original science fiction thriller, budgeted at $115 million, carried the weight of a genuine event release, and the early response suggested it might justify that billing. After 3 weekends, the domestic total sat at $94 million and the worldwide at $193 million against a break-even estimate of approximately $300 million, a break-even point being the threshold where a film's total global earnings cover both production and marketing costs. And those figures aren't catastrophic so much as quietly insufficient, which produces its own particular kind of sting. Spielberg's last unambiguous global hit, Ready Player One in 2018, cleared $607 million worldwide, and Disclosure Day was tracking toward a domestic ceiling somewhere between $105 million and $115 million. That would position it as the third highest grossing wholly original film of 2026, a framing that sounds encouraging until the $115 million production cost enters the calculation, and that figure covers production alone before marketing. Mixed audience word of mouth prevented the strong opening from compounding into the sustained run a film of this scale requires to work financially. For the filmmaker who once made audiences afraid of the ocean with a $9 million movie, the gap between ambition and outcome here lands harder than the raw numbers suggest. Jon Favreau directed The Mandalorian and Grogu, which opened to $81 million domestically on May 22nd and continued declining through June, carrying a production budget of approximately $165 million before marketing, and a break-even estimate sitting between $500 million and $600 million. At the time of research, the worldwide total tracked past $325 million, which sounds like a reasonable outcome until you place it against what the film actually needed to earn in order to stop losing money. The core irony cuts deep. The Mandalorian on Disney Plus was a cultural phenomenon that turned Grogu into one of the most merchandised characters in the franchise's history, so the logic of converting that streaming audience to theatrical wasn't unreasonable on its face. What studios keep discovering and keep appearing surprised by is that streaming audiences and theatrical audiences overlap far less than the projections assume, the theatrical window being the exclusive period a film plays in cinemas before moving to streaming, and the enthusiasm of a subscriber base doesn't automatically translate into willingness to buy a ticket. The Mandalorian and Grogu was tracking as the lowest-grossing live-action Star Wars film ever, trailing Solo, a Star Wars story's $392.09 million global total. Solo was considered such a commercial failure at the time that it reshaped how Lucasfilm approached the entire franchise going forward, and this film was heading toward comparable territory with a property considerably more beloved. For Disney, a company whose theatrical strategy under Bob Iger has been under scrutiny since the post-pandemic recovery, this outcome adds another data point to a conversation the studio would clearly prefer not to be having. That's a remarkable place to end up. This one's almost the opposite problem from Dead Man's Wire, because Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, had every structural advantage a film can have coming in. Craig Gillespie directed, and this is the filmmaker who turned Cruella into a crowd pleaser and shaped Tanya into an awards contender, bringing genuine range to studio productions. Millie Alcock carries the lead as Kara Zor-El, with Jason Momoa as Lobo and David Corenswet appearing as Superman, and the production budget of $170 million reflected how seriously Warner Brothers and DC Studios were investing in this corner of their universe. A universe James Gunn has been publicly rebuilding from the ground up since taking over as DC Studios co-CEO alongside Peter Safran. The opening weekend produced $37 million domestic and $62.06 million worldwide across 3,600 North American theaters, against a break-even estimate Variety placed between $300 million and $375 million, and Deadline projected the film would ultimately lose $125 million. The Rotten Tomatoes critics score settled at 56%, the cinema score at B-, and the opening weekend audience broke 59% male, confirming the film hadn't reached beyond the core superhero base it needed to expand past in order to work at this budget level. Superman opened the year before and cleared $618 million worldwide, making Supergirl's global opening barely a tenth of that figure. Gillespie is a talented filmmaker, and Alcock is a genuinely compelling screen presence, and the failure reads more like a brand problem than a creative one. For David Zaslav and Warner Brothers Discovery, a studio still navigating the financial turbulence of its merger years, a projected loss of $125 million on what was supposed to be a franchise cornerstone is a difficult number to absorb. The losses, though, don't care about the reason. Nothing in June 2026 captures the full shape of legacy IP meeting the wrong moment, quite like Masters of the Universe, a production with every conceivable resource behind it that still managed to finish second on its opening weekend to a horror comedy. Travis Knight directed, bringing the credibility he built on Bumblebee, the film widely credited with rescuing the Transformers franchise's theatrical reputation. Nicholas Galitzine plays Prince Adam in He-Man, Jared Leto plays Skeletor, and the supporting cast includes Idris Elba, Kristen Wiig, Alison Brie, and Camila Mendes, a lineup that signals genuine studio confidence in the material. The production budget fell between $170 million and $200 million depending on the source, with marketing costs sitting on top of that figure, and the opening weekend returned $29.03 million domestic and $54.03 million worldwide. The second weekend dropped 70% to $8.06 million domestic, and the worldwide total through late June 2026 sat at $110 million against a production cost that may have reached $200 million before a single advertising dollar entered the equation. The audience scores tell a genuinely confusing story. 67% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, 88% from audiences, and a cinema score of B, meaning the people who showed up mostly liked what they saw. Only 4% of the opening night audience was under 12 years old, which confirmed that Masters of the Universe played almost exclusively to adults who remembered the 1980s toy line and cartoon. A nostalgia audience and a franchise-building audience are two very different things, and a $200 million production budget requires the second kind. The comparison to Barbie is instructive here. Mattel's Barbie in 2023 cleared $1.04 billion worldwide, not by chasing the nostalgia audience that already owned the product, but by building a cultural conversation broad enough to pull in people who hadn't thought about a Barbie doll in decades. Masters of the Universe found the fans. It never found the conversation. The detail that makes the whole situation almost darkly funny is the Netflix chapter. Netflix originally greenlit this film, spent $30 million in development, then canceled the project in July 2023 over budgetary concerns. Amazon MGM acquired the rights shortly after and poured up to $200 million into production. Netflix absorbed a $30 million loss and walked away. Amazon stepped in and may have lost well over $100 million beyond that. The studio that cut its losses is looking considerably more prescient in hindsight. Jared Leto was notably absent from the press tour and offered no visible social media promotion for the film, and whatever the reason for that absence, it didn't help a release that needed every available lift. Amazon's distribution team publicly described the opening as a solid start, and the numbers described something with considerably less optimism. The original 1987 Masters of the Universe film also collapsed theatrically before finding a cult audience through home video, and Amazon has reportedly expressed hope for a similar long-tail outcome. That's not an unreasonable hope, and it's also not the result anyone envisioned when committing to a $200 million production. The pattern running through every entry on this list is consistent enough that calling it bad luck stops being credible. Legacy IP, with budgets built on the assumption that name recognition converts automatically to ticket sales, failed repeatedly and expensively across a single month. Meanwhile, Backrooms, a horror film directed by a 20-year-old filmmaker drawing on a Gen Z internet mythology, with no legacy studio IP behind it, cleared $330 million worldwide on a fraction of these budgets. Obsession returned $370 million on a production budget of $750,000. These aren't anomalies. They're the market correcting in real time. The audiences are still showing up to cinemas. They're choosing differently than the studios projected, and the studios writing $200 million checks for 1980s toy lines are finding that out in real time. The films that collapsed in June 2026 weren't all poorly made. Several were competently assembled, well-cast, and reasonably reviewed. What connected them was the shared assumption that familiarity would do the work that storytelling and marketing were supposed to do. That assumption is now costing studios hundreds of millions of dollars inside a single month. And that isn't a fluke or a bad run of luck. It's a structural shift. And the studios that recognize it first will be in a fundamentally different position from the ones still operating on the old logic. The gap between what Hollywood is betting on and what audiences are actually choosing is exactly the kind of story this channel digs into. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, you're in the right place.